What if we're not the first version of civilization? What if humanity has been here before, again and again, each time erased, rebuilt, and forgotten? Think about it for a moment. We look at our world and see progress stretching back a few thousand years. We see Egypt and Mesopotamia, Greece and Rome, the rise of empires and the birth of science. We imagine ourselves at the peak of a long, unbroken climb from caves to cities, from stone tools to smartphones. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the timeline we've been taught is just the most recent chapter in a book that's been written and rewritten more times than we can count? The idea sounds impossible at first. How could entire civilizations rise to greatness and then vanish so completely that we have no memory of them? How could the evidence disappear? How could the knowledge be lost? And yet, when you start looking closely at the myths, the ruins, and the strange gaps in our understanding of the past, a different picture begins to emerge. A picture of cycles, of floods and fires, of worlds that ended and worlds that began again, of humanity climbing toward the light, only to fall back into darkness, over and over like waves breaking on an endless shore. Tonight, we're going to explore that possibility. We're going to walk through the evidence, the stories, the stones, the silences, and ask ourselves whether the world we know might be just one iteration in a series of forgotten ages. We're going to consider the myths that speak of earlier humanities, the ruins that shouldn't exist according to our timelines, and the catastrophes that could erase everything we've built in a matter of days or hours. We're going to look at what science says, what history whispers, and what the Earth itself might be trying to tell us. Because if civilization has been reset before, then everything changes. Our sense of who we are, where we came from, and how fragile our world really is, all of it shifts. And the question becomes not just has it happened before, but when will it happen again? So settle in. Let the world outside fade away. And let's begin at the beginning, or rather, at one of many beginnings, with the stories that have survived the resets carried forward in myth and memory, waiting for us to finally understand what they're trying to say. Every culture on Earth tells a story about a flood, not just any flood, a flood that covered the world, that rose higher than mountains, that drowned cities and forests and entire civilizations beneath its waters. The details change from place to place, but the core remains the same. There was a world before this one, and it ended in water. The most famous version comes from the Bible, of course. Noah and his ark, the rain that fell for 40 days and 40 nights, the animals saved 2 by 2 while the rest of the world perished. But the biblical flood is just one telling of a much older story. Long before Genesis was written, the Sumerians told of Ziusudra, a king who survived a divine flood sent to destroy humanity. The Babylonians had Utnapishtim, who built a great boat and weathered the deluge while the gods wept at what they had done. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the sole survivors of a flood sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth of a corrupt and violent age. And it's not just the Mediterranean world. The Hindus describe a great flood in the Matsya Purana, where Manu, the first man, is warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, to build a boat before the waters come. In China, the legend of Gunyu tells of a catastrophic flood that lasted for generations, reshaping the land and forcing humanity to rebuild from almost nothing. The Hopi people of North America speak of multiple worlds that came before this one, each destroyed when humanity fell out of balance, and the third world, they say, ended in a flood that swallowed everything. The Maya had their own version, recorded in the Popol Vuh. The gods created humanity multiple times, and each time, when the people failed to honor their creators, the world was destroyed. One of those destructions came as a great flood, a resin that fell from the sky and drowned the earth, wiping away the flawed creations so the gods could try again. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, whose oral traditions stretch back tens of thousands of years, tell of the time when the seas rose and swallowed the coastal lands, forcing their ancestors to flee inland. The Maori of New Zealand speak of Tauhaki, who caused a great flood to punish the wicked. In South America, the Inca remembered a deluge that destroyed the world, leaving only a handful of survivors on the highest peaks of the Andes. These are not isolated stories. They are global. They span continents, cultures, and millennia. And they all say the same thing. There was a world before, and it drowned. Now, the conventional explanation is that these myths reflect local flooding events. Rivers overflowing, tsunamis, storm surges that were so traumatic they became embedded in cultural memory and exaggerated over time. And that makes sense to a point. Floods are terrifying. They're sudden, destructive, and they leave deep scars on the communities they touch. It's natural that people would tell stories about them, and natural that those stories would grow in the telling. But here's the thing. Many of these myths don't describe local floods. They describe global floods, waters that covered the entire Earth, mountains submerged, every living thing drowned except for a chosen few. And they describe these events not as natural disasters, but as resets, as the end of one age and the beginning of another, as the destruction of a previous version of humanity. What if they're not exaggerations? What if they're memories? Consider the timeline. The last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago. As the glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically, by more than 300 feet in some estimates. Coastlines that had been dry land for millennia were swallowed by the ocean. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the waves. And where do humans tend to live? Near water, near coasts, near rivers and lakes. If there were civilizations living along those ancient shorelines, cities, settlements, centers of culture and trade, they would have been obliterated, drowned, lost beneath hundreds of feet of water where no archaeologist has ever looked because we assume there's nothing there to find. The flooding wouldn't have been instant, but it wouldn't have been slow either. There's evidence of periods where sea levels rose rapidly, perhaps in catastrophic pulses triggered by the collapse of massive ice dams or ice sheets. Imagine living in a coastal city and watching the ocean rise 10 feet in a single generation, then another 10 feet in the next. Your ports flood, your fields are swallowed, your temples and monuments disappear beneath the surf. You flee inland, carrying what you can, and the world you knew becomes a memory, a story, a myth about a flood that drowned everything. And if that happened 12,000 years ago, what about earlier? The Ice Age wasn't the first time the climate shifted dramatically. There have been other periods of rapid warming and cooling, other times when the seas rose and fell. Could there have been even older civilizations lost in earlier floods, their stories passed down and blended with the more recent catastrophe until they all became one great deluge in the collective memory of humanity? The Greek philosopher Plato wrote about Atlantis, a powerful island civilization that sank beneath the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophe. Most scholars dismiss it as allegory, a moral tale about hubris and divine punishment, but Plato claimed he was recounting a story told to the Athenian lawmaker Solon by Egyptian priests who said their records went back thousands of years further than Greece's. The priest told Solon that the Greeks were like children, remembering only the most recent disasters, while Egypt's records preserved the memory of many destructions, by fire, by flood, by plague, that had wiped out earlier civilizations. What if the priests were right? What if Atlantis wasn't allegory, but a fragment of genuine memory, distorted, mythologized, but rooted in something real? A civilization that existed before the flood, before the ice melted and was lost when the waters came? We'll never know for certain, because the ocean keeps its secrets well. But the myths remain, and they all point to the same conclusion. This is not the first time. Humanity has been here before. We built something, we lost it, and we started again. But the flood is only one kind of reset. There are others, and some of them are even more terrifying. If water is the first great destroyer in human mythology, fire is the second. Across the world, cultures speak of ages that ended not in drowning, but in burning, in flames that fell from the sky, in heat that melted stone, in light so bright it turned day into something unbearable. These stories are less famous than the flood myths, but they're just as widespread, and they suggest that whatever resets civilization doesn't always come from below. Sometimes it comes from above. The ancient Greeks believed in a cyclical view of history, divided into ages of metal, gold, silver, bronze and iron, each one progressively more corrupt and violent than the last. But they also told the story of Phaethon, the son of Helios, the sun god. Phaethon begged his father to let him drive the chariot of the sun across the sky, and Helios reluctantly agreed. But Phaethon couldn't control the horses. The chariot veered too close to the earth, scorching the land, boiling the seas and turning fertile fields into deserts. To stop the destruction, Zeus struck Phaethon down with a thunderbolt, sending him plummeting into a river. The earth was saved, but the damage was done. The story was often interpreted as a myth about youthful arrogance, but what if it was something else? What if it was a memory of the sky itself turning hostile? The Hopi, again, speak of multiple worlds. The first world, they say, was destroyed by fire. Volcanoes erupting, the earth splitting open, flames consuming everything. The second world ended in ice, and the third in flood. Each destruction came because humanity had fallen out of balance, and each time a few people were saved to carry the knowledge forward and begin again. The pattern is clear. The world ends, and the world begins. Over and over. In Hindu cosmology, time is divided into vast cycles called yugas, and at the end of each cycle, the world is destroyed and recreated. One of the forms this destruction takes is fire, specifically the fire of Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, whose dance brings the universe to an end so it can be born anew. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in existence, describes cosmic fires and celestial battles that reshape the heavens and the earth. The Norse had Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the world would be consumed by fire and flood simultaneously. The great wolf Fenrir would break free, the serpent Jormungandrs would rise from the ocean, and the fire giant Surtur would set the world ablaze with his flaming sword. After the destruction, the earth would sink into the sea and then rise again, green and fertile, ready for a new age. The Zoroastrians of ancient Persia believed in a final purification by fire, when molten metal would flow across the earth, burning away all impurity and evil, leaving only the righteous to inherit a renewed world. The Maya too spoke of worlds destroyed by fire, including one age where the people were turned into birds and fled into the trees as flames consumed the land. These aren't just poetic metaphors, They're descriptions of catastrophe. And when you start looking at the physical evidence, you find traces of events that could match these stories. Take the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden, dramatic cooling that began around 12,800 years ago and lasted for more than 1,000 years. Just as the Ice Age was ending and the climate was warming, something happened that plunged the Northern Hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions almost overnight. Temperatures dropped, ice sheets advanced again. Megafauna that had survived for millennia, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, went extinct in a geological instant. For a long time, scientists couldn't explain what caused the Younger Dryas. But in recent years, a controversial theory has gained traction, the impact hypothesis. The idea is that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid, or multiple fragments of one, struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere above North America. The impacts would have triggered massive wildfires, throwing soot and debris into the atmosphere and blocking out the sun. The sudden cooling would have followed, along with the extinction of the megafauna and possibly the collapse of the Clovis culture, one of the earliest known human societies in North America. The evidence is still debated, but it's compelling. Researchers have found a layer of sediment from that time period containing high concentrations of iridium, a rare element more common in asteroids than on Earth. They've found nanodiamonds which form under extreme heat and pressure. They've found spherules, tiny glassy beads created when rock melts and cools rapidly, the kind of thing you'd expect from an impact or an airburst. And they've found this layer not just in one place, but across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. If the impact hypothesis is correct, then the myths of fire falling from the sky aren't myths at all. They're memories. Memories of a time when the heavens opened and rained down destruction, when the forest burned and the sky turned black, when the world as people knew it came to an end. But it's not just ancient impacts we need to worry about. The sun itself is a threat. Every so often the sun releases a burst of energy called a solar flare, or a coronal mass ejection. Most of the time these events are harmless. Beautiful auroras dancing in the polar skies, nothing more. But occasionally a truly massive flare can strike the Earth's magnetic field with enough force to cause real damage. In 1859, an event called the Carrington Event sent a solar storm so powerful that telegraph systems around the world sparked and caught fire. Operators received electric shocks, papers ignited. Auroras were visible as far south as the Caribbean. If a storm like that hit today, it could fry power grids, destroy satellites, and plunge modern civilization into chaos. Now imagine a solar storm 10 times stronger, 100 times stronger. There's evidence in ice cores and tree rings of solar events in the distant past that dwarf anything we've experienced in recorded history. If one of those storms hit a pre-industrial civilization, one that relied on oral tradition, on fragile records, on knowledge passed from generation to generation, it could have been devastating. Not just physically, but culturally. The people who survived would remember the sky burning, the heat, the light, the destruction, and they would tell their children and their children's children until the memory became myth. Fire from above, fire from the sky, fire that resets the world. And then there's the fire we make ourselves. Not all resets come from nature, some come from us. There's a haunting passage in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the sacred texts of Hinduism, where the warrior Arjuna is given a vision of the god Krishna in his true cosmic form. The description is overwhelming. Thousands of mouths, thousands of eyes, a being of infinite power and terror. And then Krishna speaks of weapons that can destroy entire armies in an instant. Weapons that shine like 1,000 suns, weapons that leave the earth scorched and the survivors wishing they had died. When J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, witnessed the first nuclear test in 1945, he famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He saw the connection. He recognized that the ancient text was describing something that sounded disturbingly like a nuclear explosion. And the Bhagavad Gita isn't alone. The Mahabharata, another ancient Indian epic, describes wars fought with weapons called astras, divine weapons of immense power. Some of these weapons are described as releasing blinding light, unbearable heat, and devastation that lingers long after the battle is over. Cities are reduced to ash, rivers boil, the land becomes poisoned, and those who survive suffer from strange illnesses, hair falling out, skin blistering, weakness and death following weeks or months later. Sound familiar? The descriptions are eerily similar to the effects of nuclear weapons. And while mainstream scholars interpret these passages as mythological exaggeration or poetic metaphor, there are those who wonder if something else is going on. What if these texts are describing real events? What if, in some distant age, humanity developed technology advanced enough to destroy itself, and did? There are strange anomalies in the archaeological record that fuel this speculation. In the Indus Valley, at sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, archaeologists have found layers of vitrified stone, rock that has been melted and fused together by extreme heat. The temperatures required to create vitrification are far higher than anything a normal fire could produce. Some researchers have pointed to this as evidence of ancient nuclear warfare, though mainstream archaeology attributes it to more conventional causes like pottery kilns or natural fires. In the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa, there are vast fields of a glassy substance called Libyan desert glass and trinitite. Libyan desert glass is found scattered across the Sahara, and its origin is still debated. Some say it was formed by a meteorite impact, others by an airburst. Trinitite, on the other hand, is the glassy residue created by the first atomic bomb test in New Mexico. The two substances are remarkably similar. Could ancient desert glass have been created the same way? Then there are the stories. The Bible describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities obliterated by fire and brimstone raining from the sky, leaving the land so poisoned that nothing could grow there. Lot's wife looked back at the destruction and was turned into a pillar of salt. Or was it something else? Radiation sickness, perhaps, or the flash of an explosion so bright it burned her where she stood. The ancient Sumerian texts speak of wars between the gods, battles fought with weapons that shook the earth and split the sky. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a great cedar forest that was destroyed by fire, leaving the land barren. The Egyptian texts mention a time when the gods fought among themselves and the land was laid waste. What if these weren't gods at all? What if they were people? People with technology we can barely imagine. People who built a civilization so advanced that it could harness the power of the atom, or something even more destructive. And what if, like us, they reached a point where they turned that power against each other? It's not hard to imagine. We've come close ourselves. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union built enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over. We stood on the brink more than once, and only luck or the courage of a few individuals kept us from pulling the trigger. If we had, what would be left? Cities turned to rubble, forests burned, the atmosphere choked with ash and radiation, and in a few thousand years, After the survivors had rebuilt what they could, what would they remember? Would they have clear records of what happened, or would the truth fade into myth? Would they tell stories of gods who fought in the sky, of weapons that shone like the sun, of a world that ended in fire? The idea that an ancient civilization destroyed itself with advanced technology is, admittedly, speculative. There's no smoking gun, no undeniable proof, but the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. If a civilization did destroy itself 10,000 years ago, or 20,000, or 50,000, what would remain? Metal corrodes, stone crumbles, cities are swallowed by jungles, deserts, and seas, and if the survivors were few, scattered and traumatized, they might not have the means or the will to preserve the knowledge of what came before. They would start over from scratch, and the old world would become a story, a warning, a myth. And maybe that's what all these myths are. Warnings, echoes of a time when humanity reached too far, built too much, and paid the price. A reminder that the cycle can end not just with floods and fires from the heavens, but with fires we light ourselves. But whether the reset comes from nature or from us, the question remains: how many times has it happened? How many civilizations have risen and fallen before ours? And what evidence might still be out there waiting to be found? If civilizations have been reset before, you'd expect to find traces, ruins, artifacts, something that doesn't fit the timeline we've been taught. And when you start looking, you find exactly that. There are structures scattered across the world that defy easy explanation. Not because they're impossible, clearly they exist, but because they seem too advanced, too precise, too ambitious for the cultures we believe built them. They sit like riddles in stone, challenging our assumptions about what ancient people could and couldn't do. Take Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in the 1990s, it's a massive complex of stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures. The site is breathtaking in its artistry and scale. But here's the thing, it's nearly 12,000 years old. That puts it firmly in the Neolithic period, a time when, according to conventional archaeology, humans were just beginning to figure out agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile groups, with no cities, no writing, no complex social structures. And yet, Göbekli Tepe exists. It would have required hundreds of people working together, coordinating their efforts, quarrying and transporting massive stones, carving them with sophisticated tools. It suggests a level of organization and ambition that shouldn't have been possible, and then, after it was built, it was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble and soil, hidden away, as if someone wanted to erase it from memory. Why? What was Göbekli Tepe? A temple? An astronomical observatory? A monument to something lost? And who built it? The people we think of as primitive hunter-gatherers, or the remnants of an earlier, more advanced culture, trying to preserve something before it was forgotten entirely. Then there's Baalbek in Lebanon. The Roman temple complex there is impressive enough on its own, but beneath the Roman construction lies something even more mysterious. The foundation stones. 3 massive blocks of limestone, each weighing around 800 tons, fitted together so precisely that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. They're called the trilithon, and no one knows how they were moved or placed. The Romans didn't claim to have built them. They built on top of them, suggesting the stones were already ancient when the Romans arrived. 800 tons, To put that in perspective, the largest stones used in the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh around 80 tons. The trilithon stones are 10 times heavier. Modern cranes can lift that much, but only the very largest, and they require careful planning and infrastructure. How did ancient people do it? And more importantly, why? What was so important that it required stones of such impossible size? The same question applies to Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above Cusco in Peru. The walls are made of stones that weigh up to 200 tons, cut and fitted together with such precision that, again, you can't fit a blade between them. These stones aren't rectangular, they're polygonal, with multiple angles and curves, each one unique, each one fitting perfectly with its neighbours like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. The Inca, who controlled the region when the Spanish arrived, said they didn't build Sacsayhuaman. They said it was built by the gods, or by a race of giants who lived before them. The Spanish chroniclers recorded these claims but dismissed them as superstition. Modern archaeologists attribute the construction to the Inca, despite the Inca's own insistence that they didn't do it. But if the Inca didn't build it, who did? And if they did, why don't we find similar construction techniques anywhere else in the Inca Empire? Sacsayhuaman stands alone, an anomaly, a masterpiece of engineering that seems to belong to a different age. Then there are the underwater ruins. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, divers have found what appears to be a submerged stone structure. Terraces, steps, flat platforms, right angles. Some researchers believe it's a natural formation, shaped by erosion and geological processes. Others argue that it's man-made, a remnant of a civilization that existed when sea levels were lower, before the end of the Ice Age. The debate continues, but the structure remains, silent and enigmatic beneath the waves. Similar formations have been reported off the coasts of India, Cuba, and the Mediterranean. Most are dismissed or ignored, because they don't fit the narrative. If they're real, if they're man-made, then they suggest that people were building complex structures more than 10,000 years ago, during a time when we're told they were barely surviving. And if sea levels rose and drowned those structures, how much else was lost? How many coastal cities, how many harbours and temples and monuments now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water, unseen and unsearched? The problem is that underwater archaeology is expensive and difficult. The ocean is vast and most of it has never been explored. We've mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than we've mapped the floor of our own oceans. If there are ruins down there, ruins of civilizations that existed before the flood, we might never find them. Or if we do, it'll be by accident, and by then, how much will have been lost to time and tide? But it's not just massive stones and submerged ruins. There are smaller anomalies too, artifacts that don't belong. In the 1900s, divers recovering cargo from an ancient shipwreck off the coast of Greece found a corroded lump of bronze and wood. When researchers examined it, they discovered gears. Dozens of interlocking gears, precisely cut, forming a complex mechanism. It's called the Antikythera mechanism, and it's an ancient analog computer used to predict the positions of the sun, moon and planets. It dates to around 100 BCE, and it's so sophisticated that nothing remotely comparable appears in the historical record for another 1,000 years. How did the Greeks build it? Where did the knowledge come from? And if they could build something like that, what else could they do? What other technologies did they possess that we've lost or forgotten? There are other examples. The Baghdad Battery, a clay jar from ancient Mesopotamia that some believe was used to generate electricity. The Piri Reis map, a 16th century chart that appears to show the coastline of Antarctica accurately centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered and at a time when it should have been covered in ice. The dropper stones, mysterious discs found in a cave in China, carved with tiny hieroglyphs that no one has been able to translate. Some of these artifacts are controversial, some are probably misunderstood or misidentified, but taken together, they paint a picture of a past that's more complex, more mysterious than the neat timeline we've constructed. They suggest that knowledge has been lost and found and lost again, that the march of progress isn't a straight line but a cycle, and that we might not be as advanced as we think, or at least not as advanced as we could be if we hadn't forgotten so much. Because that's the thing about resets. They don't just destroy buildings and cities, they destroy knowledge. Libraries burn, scrolls rot, oral traditions fade when the people who carry them die, and within a few generations the past becomes myth, and myth becomes legend, and legend becomes nothing at all. So how much have we forgotten? How much did the people before us know? And how many times have we had to start over, rebuilding from the ruins, rediscovering fire and the wheel, and writing, while the ghosts of the old world watch from the stones we can't explain? One of the strangest things about human history is how recent it all seems. We have cities that are 5,000 years old, writing that goes back maybe 6,000 years, agriculture that started around 10 to 12,000 years ago, and before that, almost nothing. A vast stretch of time, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, where anatomically modern humans existed, but left almost no trace of complex civilization. Homo sapiens has been around for at least 200,000 years, possibly longer. For most of that time, we were hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, following the herds, gathering plants, making tools from stone and bone. And then suddenly, around 12,000 years ago, everything changed. We started farming. We built permanent settlements. We developed pottery, weaving, metallurgy. We created art, religion, government. We built cities and temples and monuments. Civilization exploded into existence, seemingly out of nowhere. Why? The standard explanation is that the end of the Ice Age created favourable conditions for agriculture. The climate warmed, the glaciers retreated, and suddenly there was more arable land, more predictable weather, more resources. People settled down, started planting crops, and the rest followed naturally. But that explanation has always felt incomplete. Humans were just as intelligent 50,000 years ago as they are today. They had the same brains, the same capacity for language and abstract thought and innovation. So why did it take so long for civilization to emerge? Why did we spend nearly 200,000 years as hunter-gatherers, and then suddenly, in the blink of an eye, become builders and farmers and priests? One possibility is that we didn't. One possibility is that civilization emerged before, perhaps many times, and was destroyed, and the 12,000-year mark isn't the beginning of civilization, it's the beginning of the current cycle, the latest attempt, the newest chapter in a story that's been told and retold over and over since the dawn of our species. Think about it. If a civilization existed 30,000 years ago, or 50,000, or 100,000, what would remain? Wood rots, fabric disintegrates, even stone erodes given enough time, metal corrodes and crumbles, glass shatters. The only things that last are the hardest materials, certain types of stone, ceramics, maybe some metals in the right conditions, and even those can be buried, scattered, or destroyed by geological processes. And then there's the problem of ice. during the Ice Age, much of the northern hemisphere was covered by glaciers miles thick. Those glaciers moved, grinding everything beneath them into dust. If there were cities in Europe or North America during the Ice Age, they would have been obliterated, scraped away, leaving no trace. The same goes for coastal areas. As we've discussed, sea levels have risen dramatically since the Ice Age ended. If ancient civilizations built their cities near the coasts, and why wouldn't they? Those cities are now underwater, buried under sediment, invisible to us. So the absence of evidence doesn't mean much. We're looking in the wrong places, or we're not looking at all because we assume there's nothing to find. But there are hints, strange gaps in the archaeological record, sudden jumps in technology that don't seem to have any precursor. The appearance of agriculture, for example, is often described as the Neolithic revolution. But it wasn't really a revolution. It happened independently in multiple places around the world: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, within a relatively short span of time. Almost as if people in different parts of the world suddenly remembered how to farm, or were taught by someone who already knew. The same goes for megalithic construction. Around the same time that agriculture appeared, people started building massive stone structures: Göbekli Tepe, the megalithic temples of Malta, the stone circles of Britain and Europe. These structures required knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and social organization. Where did that knowledge come from? Did it develop independently in each place, or was it inherited from an earlier culture, passed down through myth and memory until people were ready to use it again? There's also the mystery of the megafauna extinctions. At the end of the last ice age, dozens of large animal species went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. The timing coincides with the rise of human populations and the spread of hunting, leading many scientists to conclude that humans hunted them to extinction. But some researchers have questioned this. The extinctions happened very quickly, almost simultaneously across different continents, and they affected species that had survived previous climate changes without issue. Could something else have been involved? A catastrophe that killed not just the animals, but also any human civilizations that existed at the time. And then there are the stories, the myths we've already discussed, the floods, the fires, the wars, all describe worlds that came before this one, worlds that were destroyed. And in many of these myths, the survivors are described as carrying knowledge from the old world into the new. The gods teach humanity how to farm, how to build, how to write. Prometheus brings fire. Quetzalcoatl teaches the Maya agriculture and astronomy. Osiris brings civilization to Egypt. Viracocha does the same in the Andes. What if these gods were people, survivors of the previous cycle, carrying the remnants of their knowledge forward, trying to rebuild? They would have seemed like gods to the people they encountered, people who had lost everything, who were starting over from scratch. And over time, the memory of those teachers would be mythologized, turned into divine figures, until the truth was buried beneath layers of legend. It's a compelling idea, and it fits the pattern we see in the myths: a world that ends, a few who survive, and a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Each time, a little more is lost. Each time, the new civilization starts from a lower baseline, until eventually, the memory of the old world fades entirely, and we're left with nothing but stories. But if that's true, then the silence in the timeline isn't a mystery. It's a scar. A gap left by the resets, by the cycles of destruction and rebirth that have shaped our species since the beginning. And the question becomes, how many scars are there? How many times have we risen and fallen? And are we approaching the next scar, the next silence, the next reset? The thing about resets is that they don't announce themselves. They don't give warnings. They just happen. One day the world is normal. People go about their lives, building and creating and planning for the future. And then, in an instant, everything changes. The ground shakes, the sky darkens, the waters rise, and the world as they knew it ends. We like to think we're safe from that kind of catastrophe. We have technology, science, early warning systems. We can predict earthquakes, sort of. We can track hurricanes and volcanic eruptions. We can see asteroids coming, at least the big ones. But the truth is, we're not as safe as we think. There are threats out there that we can't predict, can't prepare for, and might not even see coming until it's too late. Take supervolcanoes. There are several around the world. Yellowstone in the United States, Toba in Indonesia, the Campi Flegrei in Italy. And when they erupt, they don't just destroy the surrounding area. They change the climate of the entire planet. The eruption of Toba, around 75,000 years ago, is believed to have caused a volcanic winter that lasted for years, dropping global temperatures and pushing humanity to the brink of extinction. Genetic evidence suggests that the human population bottlenecked around that time, dropping to as few as 10,000 individuals. We almost didn't make it. And Toba could erupt again. Yellowstone could erupt. We don't know when, and we don't know how to stop it. If it happens, the ash would block out the sun, crops would fail, and billions of people would starve. Civilization as we know it would collapse, and the survivors would be left to start over in a world that had turned hostile and dark. Then there are asteroid impacts. We've gotten better at tracking near-Earth objects, but we're far from perfect. Most of the asteroids we've catalogued are the big ones, the kind that would cause an extinction-level event if they hit. But there are thousands, maybe millions of smaller asteroids that we haven't found yet. An asteroid just a few hundred meters across could destroy a city. One a kilometer across could trigger a global catastrophe. And if it came from the right angle, or if we simply didn't see it in time, there would be nothing we could do. The Tunguska event in 1908 is a reminder of how vulnerable we are. An asteroid or comet exploded in the atmosphere over Siberia, flattening 2,000 square kilometers of forest. If it had hit a few hours later, it could have destroyed a major city, and we had no warning. We didn't even know it was coming. Then there's the sun. We've already talked about solar flares, but it's worth emphasizing just how dangerous they can be. A direct hit from a massive coronal mass ejection could fry power grids across entire continents. No electricity means no refrigeration, no transportation, no communication, no water pumps, no hospitals. Modern civilization would grind to a halt within days, and unlike an asteroid, we can't deflect a solar storm. We can only watch it come and hope it misses. There are other threats too. Gamma-ray bursts from distant supernovae, capable of stripping away the Earth's ozone layer and bathing the surface in lethal radiation. Rogue planets, wandering through the galaxy, that could destabilize the orbits of the planets in our solar system. Magnetic pole reversals, which happen every few 100,000 years and could leave the Earth temporarily unprotected from cosmic radiation. And then there are the threats we create ourselves. Nuclear war, as we've discussed, but also biological weapons, engineered pandemics, artificial intelligence run amok, environmental collapse. We're very good at building things that could destroy us, and we're not always so good at controlling them. The point is, resets don't require ancient gods or lost civilizations. They can happen naturally at any time, and we might not see them coming. And when they do happen, the results are the same. Cities destroyed, populations decimated, knowledge lost. The survivors are left to pick up the pieces and start over, and within a few generations the old world becomes a myth. So how many times has it happened? How many times has humanity been brought to the brink only to claw its way back? And how many times have we not made it back? How many cycles ended with no survivors, no memory, no trace? We don't know, we can't know, but the evidence suggests that it's happened before and it will happen again. The only question is when. If you step back and look at the big picture, a pattern emerges, not just in the myths and the ruins, but in the very structure of time itself. The Earth moves in cycles, the seasons change, the climate shifts, ice ages come and go, each one lasting tens of thousands of years, separated by brief warm periods like the one we're living in now. These cycles are driven by changes in the Earth's orbit and axial tilt, Milankovitch cycles they're called, and they're predictable, at least in the long term. We know that another ice age is coming eventually. We just don't know when. But within those long cycles there are shorter ones. The Sun goes through an 11-year cycle of activity, with periods of high and low solar output. The Earth's magnetic field fluctuates, weakening and strengthening over centuries and millennia. Ocean currents shift, driven by changes in temperature and salinity, and those shifts can trigger rapid climate changes. The Gulf Stream, for example, which keeps Europe warm, could shut down if enough fresh water from melting ice dilutes the North Atlantic. If that happens, Europe could plunge into a mini ice age within a matter of decades. And then there are the cycles we don't fully understand. The rise and fall of civilizations, for example. Empires grow, reach their peak, and then collapse over and over with eerie regularity. The Romans, the Mayans, the Egyptians, the Khmer, the Anasazi, all of them built great civilizations and all of them fell. Sometimes the collapse was gradual, a slow decline over centuries. Other times it was sudden, a matter of decades or even years. And in many cases we still don't know exactly why it happened. Some collapses are clearly linked to environmental factors, droughts, floods, soil depletion. Others seem to be driven by internal factors, political instability, economic inequality, overextension. But there's often a sense that the collapse was inevitable, that the civilization had reached a point of no return, and that no amount of effort could have saved it. The historian Arnold Toynbee studied the rise and fall of civilizations and concluded that they follow a predictable pattern: genesis, growth, breakdown, and disintegration. Each civilization faces challenges, and how it responds to those challenges determines whether it survives or collapses. But eventually every civilization fails. The question is not if, but when. And if individual civilizations follow cycles, why not humanity as a whole? Why not the entire species, rising and falling in great waves, each wave reaching a little higher or a little lower than the last, but always following the same basic pattern? The ancient Greeks believed in the concept of the great year, a cycle lasting thousands of years, at the end of which the planets would return to their original positions and history would begin again. The Hindus believe in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and decline, which will eventually give way to a new golden age. The Maya had their long count calendar, which tracked cycles of creation and destruction spanning thousands of years. These aren't just philosophical ideas, they're reflections of a deep human intuition that time is not linear, but circular, that what has happened before will happen again, that the end is also the beginning. And maybe they're right. maybe we're living in one of many cycles, one of many attempts by humanity to build something lasting, and maybe, like the civilizations that came before us, we're approaching the end of our cycle. The signs are there, if you know where to look. Climate change, resource depletion, political instability, the rise of technologies we don't fully understand and can't fully control. We're pushing the limits of what the planet can sustain, and we're doing it faster than any civilization in history. The question is, will we be different? Will we break the cycle, or will we follow the same path as those who came before us? Will we learn from the past, or will we repeat it? And if we do collapse, what will the next cycle look like? Will the survivors remember us? Will they tell stories about the people who built cities of glass and steel, who flew through the air and spoke across oceans, who reached for the stars and then fell back to Earth? Or will we fade into myth, like Atlantis, like the gods of old, until we're nothing but a whisper in the dark? If civilizations have been reset, before then someone must have remembered. Someone must have carried the knowledge forward, even if only in fragments. In almost every culture, there are stories of wise teachers who appeared after the catastrophe, bringing knowledge and guidance to the survivors. In Egypt, it was Thoth, the god of wisdom, who taught writing and mathematics. In Mesopotamia, it was the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came from the sea and taught humanity the arts of civilization. In Mesoamerica, it was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who brought agriculture and astronomy. In the Andes, it was Viracocha, the creator god, who walked among the people and showed them how to build and farm. These figures are always described as coming from somewhere else, from the sea, from the sky, from a distant land. They're always associated with knowledge that seems too advanced for the time, and they're always credited with jump-starting civilization, with taking people from a state of barbarism or ignorance and lifting them up. What if these stories are based on real people? Not gods, but survivors of the previous cycle, carrying the remnants of their knowledge forward. They would have seemed like gods to the people they encountered. People who had lost everything, who were struggling to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. And over time, the memory of those teachers would be mythologized, turned into divine figures, until the truth was buried beneath layers of legend. But the knowledge would remain, encoded in myths, in symbols, in the structures they built. The pyramids, the megaliths, the temples, all of them might be more than just monuments. They might be messages left by the memory keepers, trying to preserve something important for the next cycle. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's one of the most studied structures in the world, and yet it's still full of mysteries. The precision of its construction is astonishing. The base is leveled within a fraction of an inch. The sides are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. The dimensions encode mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio. Some researchers believe the pyramid was designed as a kind of time capsule, a repository of knowledge encoded in its measurements and proportions. The same has been said of other ancient structures. Stonehenge, for example, is aligned with the solstices and may have been used as an astronomical observatory. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia are laid out to mirror the constellation Draco as it appeared in the sky thousands of years ago. The Nazca lines in Peru, massive geoglyphs that can only be fully appreciated from the air, may have been a kind of map or calendar, encoding information about the stars and the seasons. And then there are the myths themselves. Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of mythology, argued that myths are not just stories, they're carriers of deep truths, encoded in symbolic language. They preserve knowledge about the human condition, about the cycles of life and death, about the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. And if Campbell was right, then the myths about resets, the floods, the fires, the wars, might be preserving knowledge about real events, real catastrophes that shaped our species. The problem is that we've forgotten how to read the myths. We treat them as entertainment, as primitive superstition, as relics of a less enlightened age. But what if they're more than that? What if they're the last surviving fragments of a much older knowledge, a knowledge that was once common but has been lost and rediscovered and lost again, over and over with each cycle? The memory keepers tried to preserve it. They built structures that would last. They encoded knowledge in stories and symbols. They passed it down through secret societies, mystery schools, priesthoods. But with each reset, a little more was lost. The signal degraded. The message became garbled, until all that remained were fragments, myths that no one believed, ruins that no one understood, symbols that no one could read. And now, here we are, at the end of another cycle, trying to piece it all together, trying to remember what we've forgotten, trying to understand the warnings that were left for us before it's too late. So how many times has civilization been reset? We don't know. We can't know. The evidence is too fragmentary, too ambiguous, too buried beneath the weight of time. But the question itself is important, because it forces us to confront the possibility that we're not as unique as we think, that we're not the pinnacle of human achievement, but just the latest iteration in a long series of attempts, that the story of humanity is not a straight line from caves to cities, but a spiral, circling back on itself, rising and falling over and over. And if that's true, then everything changes. Our sense of progress, our confidence in the future, our belief that we're building something permanent, all of it becomes uncertain. Because if civilizations have been reset before, they can be reset again. And there's no guarantee that we'll survive the next one. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the resets are not punishments or accidents, but part of the natural order. A way for the Earth to cleanse itself, to start fresh, to give life another chance. And maybe humanity's role is not to escape the cycle, but to learn from it, to carry the knowledge forward, to become the memory keepers for the next cycle, to leave behind something that will help the survivors rebuild. Or maybe the cycle can be broken. Maybe we can learn from the mistakes of the past, avoid the catastrophes that destroyed the civilizations before us, and build something that lasts. Maybe we can be the ones who finally get it right. But to do that, we have to remember. We have to look at the myths, the ruins, the anomalies, and ask ourselves, what are they trying to tell us? What did the people before us know that we've forgotten? And what can we learn from their mistakes? Because the clock is ticking. The signs are all around us. The climate is changing. The resources are running out. The tensions are rising. And if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves at the end of another cycle, watching the world we built crumble around us, wondering how it all went wrong. And the survivors, if there are any, will tell stories about us. Stories about the people who flew to the moon and split the atom, who built towers that touched the sky, and machines that could think. Stories about the people who had everything and lost it all. And those stories will become myths, and those myths will be forgotten, and the cycle will begin again, unless we break it, unless we remember, unless we learn. There's a story written in our DNA, a story that contradicts everything we think we know about the smooth, steady progress of human civilization. It's a story of catastrophe, of populations crashing to the edge of extinction, of humanity reduced to a handful of survivors clinging to life in a world that had turned hostile. And it's happened not once, but multiple times. When scientists first began studying human genetics in detail, they discovered something strange, something that didn't fit the narrative of a species that had been steadily growing and expanding for hundreds of thousands of years. They found evidence of what's called a population bottleneck, a moment when the total human population dropped to a tiny fraction of what it had been before. The most famous of these is the Toba bottleneck, which we mentioned earlier. Around 75,000 years ago, something reduced the human population to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. That's it. The entire human species, which had been spread across Africa and possibly into Asia, was reduced to a number small enough to fit into a modern sports stadium. For perspective, that's a smaller population than most small towns. It's fewer people than attend an average high school. And for a period that may have lasted thousands of years, those few thousand people were all that stood between humanity and total extinction. What caused it? The conventional explanation is the Toba supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia, which would have thrown enough ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to trigger a volcanic winter lasting years, possibly decades. Temperatures would have plummeted. Plant life would have died. Animals would have starved. And humans, already scattered in small groups across a vast landscape, would have been decimated. But here's what's interesting. The genetic evidence suggests this wasn't the only bottleneck. There are signs of other population crashes, other moments when humanity was pushed to the brink. Some geneticists have found evidence of a bottleneck around 900,000 years ago, long before modern humans even existed, that reduced the population of our ancestors to just over 1,000 breeding individuals. The species survived, obviously, but barely, and there are hints of more recent events as well. Localized bottlenecks in specific populations, genetic markers that suggest sudden, dramatic reductions in diversity. The kind of patterns you'd expect to see if entire civilizations were wiped out, leaving only scattered survivors to carry on. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. When a population goes through a severe bottleneck, it doesn't just lose people, it loses genetic diversity. Rare genes, unique traits, variations that might have been useful. All of them can disappear if the individuals carrying them don't survive. The population that emerges from the bottleneck is more homogeneous, more similar to each other, because they're all descended from a very small number of survivors. And when you look at human genetic diversity today, what do you find? We're remarkably uniform. Far more uniform than we should be for a species that's supposedly been around for 200,000 years. Chimpanzees, which live in a much smaller geographic range than humans, have significantly more genetic diversity than we do. So do gorillas. So do many other species that are far less widespread. Why? The most likely explanation is that we've gone through multiple severe bottlenecks, events that killed off most of humanity, leaving only small pockets of survivors to rebuild. And each time it happened, we lost a little more diversity, a little more of what made us varied and adaptable. But we also gained something. We gained resilience. Because the people who survived those bottlenecks weren't random. They were the ones who were smart enough, adaptable enough, lucky enough to make it through. They were the ones who could survive when the world fell apart, and they passed that survival instinct down to us. If you want to understand what a reset looks like, don't just look at humans, look at everything else that disappeared at the same time. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Across the entire planet, dozens of large animal species, Megafauna, went extinct in what appears to have been a geological instant. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, short-faced bears, woolly rhinoceroses, giant beavers the size of modern bears, armadillos the size of cars, all gone. These were animals that had survived for millions of years. They had weathered previous ice ages, previous climate shifts, previous environmental changes. They were successful, well-adapted, dominant species, and then suddenly they weren't. The conventional explanation is the overkill hypothesis, that humans, spreading across the continents and becoming more efficient hunters, simply killed them all. We hunted the mammoths to extinction. We wiped out the giant sloths. We were so effective, so destructive, that we eliminated dozens of species in just a few thousand years. And there's some evidence for this. Human kill sites have been found with mammoth bones. We know humans hunted these animals. We know that wherever humans arrived, Australia, the Americas, Madagascar, waves of extinctions followed. But the timeline is problematic. The extinctions didn't happen gradually, as you'd expect if humans were slowly hunting species to extinction over thousands of years. They happened rapidly, almost simultaneously across different continents. Species that had never encountered humans went extinct at the same time as species that had been living alongside humans for tens of thousands of years. In North America, the extinctions were particularly severe. Roughly 80% of large mammal species disappeared. In South America, the number was similar. In Australia, which humans had reached much earlier, the extinctions happened thousands of years before, around 45,000 years ago. But again, they were rapid and devastating. Something doesn't add up. If humans were the sole cause, why didn't the extinctions happen gradually as human populations grew? Why did they cluster around specific time periods? And why did they affect animals that humans didn't even hunt, like giant tortoises and large flightless birds on remote islands? The alternative explanation is that something else happened. Something catastrophic that affected the entire planet. And humans didn't cause the extinctions. We survived them, barely, along with the few other large animals that made it through. Remember the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis? The idea that a comet or asteroid struck the Earth around 12,800 years ago, triggering the sudden cooling period that lasted more than 1,000 years. If that happened, it would explain a lot. The impacts would have triggered massive wildfires, throwing soot and debris into the atmosphere. The sky would have darkened, temperatures would have plummeted, plant life would have died, and herbivores, which depended on that plant life, would have starved. The carnivores that depended on the herbivores would have followed, and the few animals that survived would have been those that were adaptable enough, small enough, or lucky enough to find shelter and food in the chaos. Humans survived. But we weren't unscathed. If the genetic bottleneck evidence is correct, our population crashed. We were reduced to scattered bands, struggling to survive in a world that had become hostile and strange. And when we finally recovered, when we finally started building civilizations again, the megafauna were gone. The world we emerged into was emptier, quieter, smaller than the one that had existed before, and we forgot. We forgot what it had been like to live alongside mammoths and saber-toothed cats. We forgot that there had been creatures so large they could shake the earth when they walked. The memory faded into myth, stories of giants, of monsters, of legendary beasts that our ancestors defeated in the distant past. But the bones remain, scattered across the world, buried in tar pits and frozen in permafrost. The bones of the megafauna remind us that the world was once different, that something happened, that there was a time when everything changed, and most of what existed before was lost. Language is one of the most remarkable things about being human. It's what allows us to share ideas, build cultures, pass knowledge across generations. And when you look at the diversity of human languages, you see thousands of different tongues, each with its own grammar, vocabulary and structure. But here's something strange. Almost all of them can be traced back to a handful of language families, and those families appear to have emerged relatively recently, within the last 10,000 to 15,000 years. Before that, silence, or at least a silence in the linguistic record. We have no idea what languages people spoke before the end of the last ice age, because language doesn't fossilize. It doesn't leave physical traces. It exists only in the minds and mouths of the people who speak it, and when those people die, if they haven't passed it on, the language dies with them. But linguists have noticed something curious. When they trace languages back through time, looking for common roots and ancestral tongues, they keep hitting a wall around the same period, roughly 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Beyond that point, the connections become fuzzy, speculative, impossible to prove. It's as if language itself was reset. Now that doesn't mean humans before the time didn't have language. Anatomically, modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years, and we almost certainly had language for most of that time. The capacity for language is hardwired into our brains. It's one of the things that makes us human. But something happened around 12,000 years ago that disrupted the linguistic landscape so completely that almost all traces of older languages were wiped out. What could do that? A population bottleneck, a catastrophe severe enough that only small, scattered groups of humans survived, and the languages they spoke became the ancestors of all modern languages. The diversity that had existed before, the thousands of different tongues that had developed over hundreds of thousands of years, was lost. And the new languages that emerged from the survivors were the foundation of everything that came after. There are a few languages that might be exceptions, a few isolated languages that don't seem to fit into any known family, that appear to be the last survivors of much older linguistic lineages. Basque, spoken in the Pyrenees between France and Spain, is one of them. It has no clear relationship to any other language in Europe or anywhere else. It's a linguistic island, a remnant of something that existed before the Indo-European languages swept across the continent. The same is true of some indigenous languages in the Americas, in Australia, in Papua New Guinea. Languages that seem to stand alone, unconnected to anything else. Are these the last echoes of pre-catastrophe languages, the survivors of linguistic lineages that were otherwise completely erased? We don't know. We can't know, but the pattern is suggestive. And then there's the question of why language evolved in the first place. Modern humans existed for well over 100,000 years before we see any clear evidence of complex symbolic thought, art, music, elaborate tools, jewellery. For most of our history, we seem to have been anatomically modern, but behaviourally archaic. And then suddenly, around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, something changed. We started creating art. We started burying our dead with grave goods. We started making sophisticated tools and ornaments. What happened? Some researchers call it the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the sudden emergence of modern human behaviour after tens of thousands of years of apparent stagnation. But was it really sudden? Or is it just that the evidence from before that time didn't survive? If there were earlier periods of cultural sophistication, earlier attempts at civilization, they would have been lost in the Toba bottleneck or other catastrophes. We'd only see the evidence from after the most recent reset when survivors started rebuilding, and if language was part of that earlier sophistication, if humans 100,000 years ago spoke languages as complex and rich as the ones we speak today, we'd never know. Because language leaves no fossils. It only survives if it's passed down, and if the chain is broken, if the speakers die without passing it on, the language vanishes as if it never existed. How many languages have been lost? How many words? How many concepts? How many ways of seeing the world existed once and are now gone forever? How much of human thought and culture has been erased by the resets, leaving only fragments and shadows behind? Here's something most people don't think about. If humanity has been reset multiple times, if we've been brought to the edge of extinction and forced to rebuild from almost nothing, that experience would leave scars. Not just physical scars, not just genetic scars, but psychological ones. Patterns of behavior, deep-seated fears, instincts that don't make sense in the modern world but would have been essential for survival in the aftermath of a catastrophe. And when you look at human psychology, you find exactly that. Take our fear of the dark. It's nearly universal. Children are afraid of the dark. Adults are uncomfortable in complete darkness. We have an instinctive wariness of spaces where we can't see, where we don't know what might be lurking. From a modern perspective, this doesn't make much sense. We live in cities with streetlights, homes with electricity. Darkness isn't a threat anymore. But imagine surviving a catastrophe. Imagine living in a world where the sky had darkened with ash, where the sun was obscured for months or years, where the normal cycles of day and night were disrupted. Darkness would have been terrifying. It would have been associated with cold, with hunger, with danger. The people who survived would have been the ones who were most cautious, most afraid, most willing to seek shelter and light. And they passed that fear down to us. The same is true of our fear of sudden loud noises, thunder, explosions, crashes. These trigger an immediate startle response, a spike of adrenaline, a fight or flight reaction. Why? Because in the ancestral environment, sudden loud noises meant danger, an animal attacking, a tree falling, a rock slide. Or if you were living through a catastrophe, the sound of the earth splitting open, of impacts, of destruction. Our fear of heights, our discomfort with instability and uncertainty, our tendency to hoard resources when we feel threatened. All of these could be evolutionary adaptations to surviving in a world that had become hostile and unpredictable. But there's something deeper too. Something that shows up in our myths, our dreams, our collective unconscious. Carl Jung, the psychologist, argued that humans share certain archetypal images and stories, patterns that appear in cultures all over the world, independent of contact or influence. The flood, the fire, the end of the world, the hero's journey, the wise old man or woman who teaches the survivors. Where do these archetypes come from? Jung believed they were part of the collective unconscious, a shared psychological substrate that all humans inherit. But what if they're not abstract symbols? What if they're memories? Not individual memories, but cultural memories, passed down through countless generations, of real events that happened in the deep past. What if the reason every culture has a flood myth is because every culture is descended from people who survived the flood? What if the reason we dream about falling, about being chased, about the world ending, is because those experiences are encoded somewhere in our psychological makeup, remnants of traumas that our ancestors endured. There's a concept in psychology called transgenerational trauma, the idea that trauma can be passed down from parents to children, not just through learned behaviour, but through epigenetic changes, alterations in gene expression that can persist for multiple generations. Studies of Holocaust survivors and their descendants have found evidence of this. The children and grandchildren of people who experienced extreme trauma show different stress responses, different patterns of gene expression, even though they never experienced the trauma themselves. If that's true for individual families, could it be true for entire species? Could humanity as a whole be carrying the scars of catastrophes that happened thousands of years ago? Could the anxiety, the fear, the sense of impending doom that so many people feel, even in the absence of immediate threats, be an echo of a time when those fears were justified, when the world really was ending? It's a disturbing thought, but it would explain a lot. It would explain why we're so drawn to apocalyptic stories, why we can't stop imagining the end of the world. It would explain why we build bunkers and stockpile supplies, why we have an instinct to prepare for disaster even when everything seems fine. Because deep down, we remember, not consciously, but in our bones, in our blood, in the ancient parts of our brains that evolved to keep us alive. We remember that the world has ended before. We remember that safety is an illusion. We remember that everything can change in an instant, and we're waiting for it to happen again. Let's talk about why so many ancient cultures were obsessed with the heavens. Everywhere you look, ancient civilizations built structures aligned with astronomical phenomena. The pyramids of Egypt are aligned with Orion's belt. Stonehenge marks the solstices. The temples of Angkor Wat mirror the constellation Draco. The Mayan pyramids align with Venus and other celestial bodies. The Nazca lines in Peru are best viewed from above, as if they were meant to be seen from the sky. Ancient observatories appear in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Yet they all show the same preoccupation with tracking the stars, the planets, the movements of the heavens. Why? What was so important about the sky? The conventional answer is that ancient people used the stars for calendars, for agriculture, for navigation. And that's true, as far as it goes. Knowing when to plant crops, when the seasons would change, when to expect floods or droughts. All of that would have been essential for survival. But it doesn't explain the scale of the effort. It doesn't explain why cultures would invest enormous resources, decades or centuries of labour, into building massive stone structures just to track the movements of celestial bodies. A simple wooden post would work as a sundial. A row of stones would be enough to mark the solstice. You don't need a pyramid. You don't need Stonehenge. Unless the sky wasn't just a calendar. Unless it was something more. Something dangerous. What if ancient cultures were so obsessed with tracking the heavens because they knew that's where the danger came from? What if they were watching for asteroids, for comets, for signs that another catastrophe was coming? Think about it. If your civilization had been destroyed by an impact from space, if you had survived and rebuilt, what would you do? You'd watch the sky. Obsessively. You'd track every celestial object, every anomaly, every change in the patterns you knew. You'd build structures to help you observe, to help you remember, to help you predict, and you'd teach your children to do the same, because forgetting, even for a generation, could mean extinction. The ancient astronomers weren't just priests conducting rituals. They were sentries, watchers, early warning systems for a threat that could appear at any time, without warning, and destroy everything. And there's evidence that they knew more than we give them credit for. The Sumerians had detailed astronomical records that go back thousands of years. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete. How? Why? What could they possibly use that information for, unless they were thinking in terms of deep time, unless they were trying to preserve knowledge across multiple cycles, multiple resets, unless they knew that civilizations rise and fall, and they wanted to leave markers, guideposts for whoever came after. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants. P, the golden ratio, the speed of light in some interpretations. The dimensions of the Earth and the Moon can be derived from its measurements. Some researchers believe it's a time capsule, a repository of knowledge encoded in stone, designed to survive any catastrophe and speak to whoever finds it thousands of years later. Is that crazy? Maybe. But consider this. If you wanted to preserve knowledge for the long term, for thousands or tens of thousands of years, how would you do it? Books decay. Digital storage requires technology to read. Language changes and becomes incomprehensible, but mathematics is universal, geometry is universal, and stone lasts. What if the pyramids, the megaliths, the ancient observatories aren't just monuments? What if they're messages? Messages to the future, from people who knew the past, people who had survived resets and were trying to warn us, trying to give us the tools we'd need to survive the next one. The sky was important to them because the sky was the threat. And they were trying to tell us, watch the heavens, remember, be ready, because it will happen again. One of the most unsettling things about knowledge loss is how easily it happens, how quickly a civilization can forget what it once knew. You don't need a catastrophe. You just need a few generations of people who don't think the old knowledge is important anymore. The Library of Alexandria is the classic example. One of the largest and most significant libraries of the ancient world, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls, decades or centuries of accumulated knowledge, and then it burned. Or was it gradually neglected and stripped over time? Historians disagree, but the result was the same. An immense amount of knowledge was lost. Books that existed in only a single copy were gone forever. We know the names of lost works, entire plays by Sophocles, multiple books of Livy's history of Rome, scientific treatises by Archimedes and others, but we'll never read them. They're gone. How much did we lose? We can't even estimate because we don't know what we don't know. There could have been works of genius, revolutionary discoveries, insights that would have advanced human knowledge by centuries. Or there could have been mundane administrative records. We'll never know, and Alexandria wasn't unique. The destruction of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad during the Mongol invasion in 1258 destroyed centuries of Islamic scholarship. The burning of the Mayan codices by Spanish priests eliminated almost all written records of Mayan history and knowledge. The loss of the library of the Temple of Jerusalem, the destruction of countless monasteries and their libraries during various wars and persecutions. Each time, irreplaceable knowledge vanished. But here's the thing, you don't need fire or invaders. Knowledge can be lost through simple neglect. When the Roman Empire fell, Europe entered the Dark Ages. It's not that people became stupid. They were just as intelligent as their ancestors. But the institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge collapsed. Books were no longer copied. Schools closed. Trade networks that brought materials and ideas from distant places broke down. And within a few generations, Europeans had forgotten how to build aqueducts, how to make concrete, how to perform surgeries that Roman doctors had considered routine. The knowledge didn't disappear all at once. It faded. Each generation knew a little less than the one before. Techniques became rituals, performed without understanding why. Tools were used without knowing how they'd been made, and eventually people forgot that they'd forgotten. They thought the Roman ruins were built by giants or gods, because the idea that ordinary humans had built them seemed impossible. It took 1,000 years for Europe to recover the knowledge it had lost, and it only recovered it because some of that knowledge had been preserved elsewhere, in the Islamic world, in the Byzantine Empire, in scattered monasteries where monks painstakingly copied ancient texts, often without understanding what they were copying. How much didn't survive? How much was lost permanently? We know that Roman engineers built mechanical devices, automated systems, sophisticated machinery. We have descriptions of them in ancient texts, but we don't have the devices themselves, and the descriptions aren't detailed enough to reconstruct them. The knowledge of how to build them died with the craftsmen who made them, and this keeps happening. Every civilization that falls loses knowledge. Every time a cultural chain is broken, information disappears. We've lost the ability to navigate by the stars the way Polynesian sailors could, crossing thousands of miles of open ocean with no instruments. We've lost traditional medicinal knowledge from countless indigenous cultures, plants and treatments that could have had real value but were dismissed as superstition. We've lost crafts, techniques, entire ways of understanding the world. And now, in the digital age, we're more vulnerable than ever. We store everything on systems that require constant maintenance, constant power, constant technological support. If those systems fail, we don't just lose access to the information, we lose the information itself. A book in a library can sit on a shelf for centuries and still be readable. A hard drive without power is just a useless lump of metal and plastic. We like to think we're too advanced to lose knowledge, that we have too many backups, too many copies. But the same has been true of other civilizations. The Romans thought their empire would last forever. The Mayans built cities they thought would stand for all time. The Library of Alexandria was supposed to preserve knowledge for eternity. They were all wrong, and we might be wrong too. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Because when you look at human history from a biological perspective, we're an anomaly. We shouldn't have made it this far. Most species last on average a few million years before going extinct, and most species maintain relatively stable population sizes within their ecological niches. They evolve slowly, adapt gradually, and when they can't adapt anymore, they disappear. Humans don't follow that pattern. We went from a population measured in the thousands to a population measured in the billions in just 10,000 years. We spread from Africa to every continent except Antarctica. We adapted to every climate, every environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high-altitude mountains to deserts. And we did it not through biological evolution. We're essentially identical to humans from 50,000 years ago, but through cultural evolution, through knowledge, tools, technology, social organization. That's unprecedented. No other species has done anything remotely similar. And from a biological standpoint, it's fragile. We're not physically adapted to most of the environments we live in. We survive through technology, through culture, through collective knowledge. Take that away, and we're vulnerable. Naked apes with no claws, no fangs, no fur, no natural defenses except our brains. And our brains aren't even that impressive individually. A human child raised in isolation, without culture, without language, without being taught anything, would be barely functional. They wouldn't invent language on their own. They wouldn't figure out how to make fire or tools. They'd be far less capable than an adult chimpanzee. What makes humans special isn't our individual intelligence, it's our collective intelligence, our ability to share information, to build on what previous generations learned, to accumulate knowledge over time. We're not smart individually, we're smart as a species, but that means we're dependent on the chain of transmission. If the chain breaks, if knowledge isn't passed down, we regress. Fast. Within a single generation, without elders to teach them, people forget sophisticated skills. Within a few generations, they forget that those skills ever existed. So how did we survive the bottlenecks? How did we make it through catastrophes that reduced our population to a few thousand individuals scattered across a devastated landscape? Luck is part of it. But there's also something else. Humans are incredibly adaptable, not because of our biology, but because of our culture. When the environment changes, we don't wait for evolution to adapt us. We change our behavior. We create new tools, new strategies, new social structures, and we do it fast. The survivors of the bottlenecks were the ones who are best at that, the ones who could improvise, who could learn, who could hold on to crucial knowledge and pass it down even in the worst circumstances. They were the memory keepers, the innovators, the teachers, and they were the foundation of every civilization that came after. But here's the unsettling part. We're not immune to bottlenecks now. We might think we're too advanced, too numerous, too distributed. But we're also more specialized, more dependent on systems and infrastructure, more vulnerable to disruptions. If something happened, a supervolcano, a massive solar storm, a pandemic worse than COVID, a nuclear war, runaway climate change, how many of us would survive? And more importantly, how much of our knowledge would survive? Would the survivors know how to grow food without industrial agriculture? How to purify water without modern treatment plants? How to generate power, manufacture medicine, communicate across distances? Or would they have to start over, learning everything again from scratch, rediscovering fire and the wheel and agriculture while the ruins of our civilization crumbled around them, monuments to a knowledge they could no longer access? We're the species that shouldn't have survived. We've been knocked down repeatedly, reduced to almost nothing, forced to rebuild from the edge of extinction. And we did it. We survived. We persisted. But there's no guarantee we'll keep doing it. The next reset could be the last. Or it could be just another in a long series, another turn of the wheel, another forgetting and remembering. The question is, when it comes, will we be ready? Or will we, like those before us, be caught off guard, convinced until the last moment that it couldn't happen to us? There's something strange about certain pieces of ancient knowledge, not just that they exist, but how they exist, fully formed, sophisticated, with no apparent learning curve, no trial and error, no primitive precursors. Take mathematics. The ancient Sumerians, one of the earliest civilizations we know of, didn't use a base 10 number system like we do. They used base 60, a sexagesimal system that's actually far more elegant for certain calculations. It's why we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The number 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. 12 factors, making it incredibly useful for dividing things up. But here's the question. Why would a civilization that was supposedly just figuring out agriculture and writing choose such a sophisticated mathematical system? Base 10 makes intuitive sense. We have 10 fingers. But base 60 requires a level of mathematical thinking that seems advanced for people who were, according to the standard timeline, just beginning to organize themselves into cities, unless they didn't invent it, unless they inherited it. The same pattern appears with astronomy. The ancient Mayans calculated the length of the solar year as 365 on 420 days. The modern calculation is 365 422 days. They were off by less than 2/10,000ths of a day, without telescopes, without computers, without any of the instruments we consider essential for that level of precision. They also tracked the cycles of Venus with incredible accuracy, created complex eclipse prediction tables, and understood the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. How do you discover something that takes 26,000 years to observe? You don't. Not unless you've been watching for 26,000 years, or someone before you was watching and passed the knowledge down. The ancient Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid to true north with an accuracy of 3/60th of a single degree. They calculated pi to several decimal places. Their medical texts describe surgical procedures, antibiotics made from mouldy bread, and an understanding of the circulatory system that wouldn't be discovered again until the Renaissance. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated to around 1600 BCE, but believed to be a copy of much older texts, describes 48 surgical cases with a level of anatomical knowledge that seems impossibly advanced. In ancient India, the mathematician Aryabhata calculated pi to 4 decimal places in the 5th century CE, and stated that the Earth rotates on its axis, more than 1,000 years before Copernicus. The ancient Indian texts on astronomy, the Vedanga Jyotisha, contain calculations of planetary periods that are accurate to modern standards, and the concept of zero, perhaps mathematics' most important invention, appeared in India in the 5th century CE, though some scholars believe the concept is much older. The ancient Chinese calculated the movements of the planets, predicted eclipses, and created star catalogues thousands of years ago. They invented the seismograph in 132 CE, a device that could detect earthquakes hundreds of miles away and indicate the direction they came from. They had blast furnaces capable of producing steel more than 1,000 years before Europe. They understood the magnetic compass, gunpowder and paper making at a time when much of the world was still using stone tools. And everywhere you look you find this pattern, sophisticated knowledge appearing suddenly, often with no clear developmental path. It's as if someone turned on a light switch, and humanity went from darkness to illumination in an instant. The conventional explanation is that we're simply missing the intermediate steps. The papyri rotted, the records were lost, the gradual development happened but left no trace. And that's possible. But it's also possible that the knowledge didn't develop gradually, that it was inherited, passed down from an earlier time, preserved by the memory keepers we talked about, and slowly rediscovered and reapplied as new civilizations emerged from the ruins of the old. There are hints of this in the ancient texts themselves. The Egyptians spoke of the Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when the gods walked among men and taught them the arts of civilization. The Sumerians wrote about the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood and brought wisdom to humanity. Plato wrote about the Egyptian priest who told Solon that Greece was young, that Greek records only went back to the most recent catastrophe, while Egypt remembered much older times. The Hindu Vedas speak of earlier yugas, earlier ages, when humanity possessed knowledge that was later lost. The Buddhist texts describe previous world systems, previous cycles of creation and destruction. The Zoroastrian texts speak of a time before time when knowledge was whole and complete, before it was shattered and scattered. What if they're all describing the same thing? A time before the reset, when knowledge was more complete, more integrated, before it was broken into fragments and had to be painstakingly reassembled by each new civilization that emerged from the ashes. And what if some of that knowledge is still out there, hidden in plain sight, encoded in myths and monuments, waiting for us to remember how to read it? In 1929, a Turkish officer named Piri Reis discovered a fragment of an old map in the library of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The map, dated to 1513, showed the Atlantic Ocean, the coasts of South America and Africa, and curiously what appeared to be the northern coast of Antarctica. This wouldn't be particularly remarkable except for one problem. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after the map was drawn. And the map doesn't just show Antarctica as a vague landmass. It shows details of the coastline, bays, and geographic features. Features that, in 1513, would have been buried under miles of ice. When modern scholars examined the Piri Reis map more closely, things got even stranger. In the 1960s, Charles Hapgood, a professor of the history of science, noticed that the Antarctic coastline on the map didn't match the current coastline. It matched the coastline as it would have appeared thousands of years ago before it was covered by ice. He sent the map to the US Air Force, which confirmed that the map showed features that had been discovered by modern seismic surveys, features that lay beneath the ice sheet. How is that possible? Piri Reis himself claimed that he had compiled the map from older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. He said he used about 20 older maps as references, maps that had been preserved in various libraries around the Mediterranean. But where did those maps come from? Who made them? And how did they map Antarctica before it was covered in ice? The ice sheet over Antarctica is believed to be at least 6,000 years old, and possibly much older. That means someone would have had to map the continent before 4000 BCE, well before any civilization we know of had the technology to cross the ocean, navigate to the southern pole, and conduct a detailed survey of the coastline. Unless, of course, there was a civilization we don't know about. The Piri Reis map isn't alone. There are other ancient maps that show geographic knowledge that shouldn't have existed at the time they were drawn. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 also shows Antarctica, this time with rivers and mountains free of ice. The Philippe Boische map of 1737 shows Antarctica divided into two landmasses by a waterway, a feature that was only confirmed in the 1960s when seismic surveys revealed a channel beneath the ice that does in fact divide the continent. The Mercator map of 1569 shows the Arctic with surprising accuracy, including details of the coastlines and islands that wouldn't be properly surveyed for hundreds of years. The Zeno map of 1380 shows Greenland and the North Atlantic with features that suggest the mapmakers had access to information from a time when the climate was warmer and the ice coverage was different. And then there are the Chinese maps. In 2006, a controversial map surfaced in China, purportedly dated to 1418, that showed the entire world, including the Americas, Australia and Antarctica, in remarkable detail. The map's authenticity has been hotly debated, and many scholars believe it's a modern forgery. But if it's genuine, it would mean that Chinese explorers circumnavigated the globe decades before Columbus, and had knowledge of lands that Europeans wouldn't discover for another century. The problem with all of these maps is the same. They show knowledge that shouldn't exist, and the usual explanations that they were based on older source maps only pushes the question back further. Who made those older maps? And how far back do they go? Hapgood proposed a radical theory that an advanced civilization existed during the last ice age, a maritime civilization that mapped the entire world when sea levels were lower and the climate was different. When that civilization was destroyed, by the floods at the end of the Ice Age, by asteroid impacts, by some other catastrophe, their maps survived, passed from culture to culture, copied and recopied, slowly degrading but retaining enough detail that later civilizations could use them as references. It's a compelling theory, but it's also speculative. There's no direct evidence of such a civilization, no cities, no artifacts, no clear proof. But the maps exist, the knowledge exists, and no one has yet provided a satisfactory explanation for how it came to be, unless, once again, we're looking at the remnants of something older, something that was lost but not entirely forgotten, something that the memory keepers preserved, even when they no longer understood what they were preserving or why. Let's go back to the stones, because the more you look at them, the stranger they become. It's not just that ancient cultures moved massive blocks of stone, though that alone is impressive. It's the precision with which they worked, the tolerances they achieved, the techniques they used that we still can't fully explain. Take the granite boxes inside the Great Pyramid. Deep in the bedrock beneath the pyramid, in a chamber called the Grotto, and in the king's chamber above, there are enormous boxes carved from solid granite. They're perfectly rectangular, with walls that are flat to within thousandths of an inch. The corners are exact right angles. The inside surfaces are smooth and polished. To create something like that today, you'd need industrial machinery, diamond-tipped saws, precision grinding equipment, laser measuring tools. The tolerances are tighter than you can achieve with hand tools, no matter how skilled you are. And yet, according to conventional archaeology, these boxes were carved by people using copper chisels and stone hammers. It doesn't add up. Christopher Dunn, an engineer who has studied the Great Pyramid extensively, argues that the precision of the stonework suggests the use of advanced tools, possibly even machine tools. He points to evidence of what appear to be saw marks in the granite, cuts that are too straight, too uniform, too deep to have been made by hand. He notes that some of the drill holes in the granite show a spiral pattern, as if a drill bit was used with tremendous pressure and speed. But the ancient Egyptians didn't have drill bits. They didn't have saws with teeth hard enough to cut granite. They didn't have lathes or grinding wheels powered by anything more than human muscle, or so we're told. The same mystery appears at other sites. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, there are blocks of andesite, a very hard volcanic rock, that have been carved with precision that rivals modern machine work. The blocks have flat surfaces, perfect right angles, and complex interlocking shapes that fit together like a three-dimensional puzzle. Some of the blocks have drill holes that are perfectly round and perfectly straight, showing no evidence of wobbling or drift. Again, this is supposedly the work of a pre-industrial culture, people with no written language, no wheel, no draft animals, and yet the precision is there, undeniable, measurable. At Ollantaytambo, another site in Peru, there are massive blocks of red granite that were quarried from a mountain 6 miles away, across a river, and somehow transported uphill to the construction site. The blocks weigh up to 50 tons each. They're fitted together with joints so tight you can't fit a knife blade between them, and they show evidence of some kind of vitrification or melting on their surfaces, as if they were subjected to intense heat. How? The conventional answer is always the same: time, patience, and manpower. Given enough people and enough years, you can move any stone, shape any block, build any monument. And that's true, to a point. But it doesn't explain the precision. It doesn't explain how cultures with supposedly primitive tools achieved tolerances that we struggle to match with modern equipment. It doesn't explain the evidence of advanced techniques, drilling, sawing, polishing, that shouldn't have been possible. Unless, once again, they had knowledge we don't credit them with. Techniques we've lost. Tools we haven't found, because they are made of materials that don't survive. Wood, perhaps, or bronze, or something else entirely. Or unless they inherited the techniques from an earlier time, from a civilization that did have advanced tools, advanced knowledge, and passed that knowledge down through the generations until it became fragmented, ritualized, half-remembered, so that the later builders were following instructions they didn't fully understand, replicating techniques they couldn't quite explain, working from plans that were far older than their own culture. It sounds far-fetched. But the alternative, that people with these stone hammers carved granite within thousandths of an inch, sounds even more impossible. If civilizations have been reset, then somewhere, someone must remember. Not in the mainstream, not in the official histories, but in the margins, in the oral traditions, in the secret knowledge passed down through generations of initiates and elders who are told never to forget, never to let the old ways die completely. Indigenous cultures around the world carry stories that go back much further than written history. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have oral traditions that describe events from more than 10,000 years ago. The flooding of coastal areas, the existence of land bridges that are now underwater, the megafauna that once roamed the continent. These aren't vague myths. They're specific, detailed accounts that match what geologists and archaeologists have discovered through scientific investigation. The Gunditjmara people of southeastern Australia tell of a time when the land was different, when volcanoes erupted and reshaped the landscape. Geologists have confirmed that volcanic activity in the region occurred around 30,000 years ago. The stories have been passed down, generation after generation, for 300 centuries. Think about that. 300 centuries of unbroken oral tradition. While empires rose and fell, while glaciers advanced and retreated, while the world changed again and again, these people remembered. They kept the stories alive. The same is true in other parts of the world. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds, each destroyed in turn, and they describe the migrations of their people over thousands of years across landscapes that have long since changed. The Coast Salish people of the Pacific Northwest tell of a great flood that drowned their ancestral lands that are now beneath the waters of Puget Sound, submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. In India, there are oral traditions about Kumari Kandam, a lost continent that sank beneath the Indian Ocean. The Tamil people describe it as a great landmass that connected India, Sri Lanka, and parts of what is now Southeast Asia. Modern geology has confirmed that sea levels in the region were indeed much lower during the Ice Age, and that there was once more exposed land. Did the Tamils preserve a memory of that time, passed down through countless generations? In the Middle East, the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq claim descent from the ancient Sumerians, and they preserve traditions about the time before the flood, when the world was different. In Africa, the Dogon people of Mali have astronomical knowledge that has baffled researchers. They describe the star Sirius as having a companion star, Sirius B, which is invisible to the naked eye and wasn't confirmed by Western astronomy until the 20th century. They also describe its orbital period with surprising accuracy. Where did they get this knowledge? The conventional explanation is usually that they learned it from Western astronomers in the 19th or 20th century, and the older stories were retrofitted. But the Dogon insist that the knowledge is ancient, part of their core mythology, taught to them by beings they call the Nommo, who came from the sky in ancient times. Whether you believe that or not, the pattern is clear. Indigenous cultures preserve knowledge. They remember. Even when the rest of the world forgets, even when the written records are lost or destroyed, the oral traditions survive. They're encoded in stories, in songs, in rituals that are passed down with incredible fidelity from one generation to the next. And often, those stories describe a time before, a time when things were different, a time when the world ended and began again. The question is, how much of that knowledge is accurate? How much is metaphor and how much is history? And what have we lost by dismissing these stories as primitive superstition instead of treating them as the archives they might actually be? Graham Hancock, the journalist and author who has spent decades investigating ancient civilizations, argues that indigenous traditions are a form of science, not science in the modern sense, but a systematic way of preserving and transmitting knowledge across deep time. He suggests that the myths and symbols we find around the world are not random, but deliberate attempts to encode information in ways that can survive catastrophe. Because that's the thing about oral tradition. It's resilient. You can burn a library, destroy a hard drive, erase every written record. But you can't erase a story that lives in the minds of a people, a story that's told every night around the fire, a story that's woven into the fabric of the culture itself. The memory keepers didn't just build monuments, they built cultures designed to remember. There's a tendency, when we look at ancient cultures, to assume they were primitive, that they lack the sophistication, the intelligence, the creativity that we possess. We see stone tools and think cavemen. We see pyramids and think slave labour. We see myths and think superstition. But what if we're wrong? What if ancient people were just as intelligent as we are, just as capable of innovation and problem solving, but working with different materials, different priorities, different worldviews? Consider the Antikythera mechanism again. It's not just that the Greeks built a complex mechanical computer in 100 BCE, it's that the device shows evidence of sophisticated engineering principles, differential gears, epicyclic gearing, a level of miniaturization and precision that wasn't seen again until the Renaissance. And it's not some crude prototype, it's a finished, refined product, suggesting that similar devices had been built before, that there was a tradition of mechanical engineering that we've lost almost all trace of. What else did they build that didn't survive? Devices made of wood and bronze, materials that corrode and rot. How much technology have we lost simply because it was made from things that don't last? Or take Roman concrete. The Romans built structures, aqueducts, harbours, buildings that have stood for 2,000 years, many of them still intact and functional. The Pantheon in Rome, built in 126 CE, has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, and it's still standing, still in use. Meanwhile, modern concrete structures often start crumbling after a few decades. The secret is in the mixture. The Romans used volcanic ash and seawater in their concrete, creating a chemical reaction that actually makes the concrete stronger over time, especially when exposed to seawater. We only figured out how they did it in the last few years. For centuries we thought we were more advanced than the Romans, and yet we couldn't replicate what they had achieved 2 millennia ago. What else did they know that we've forgotten? The Damascus steel of medieval Syria was legendary for its strength and sharpness, capable of cutting through European swords and armour with ease. The technique for making it was lost centuries ago, and despite modern metallurgical analysis, we still can't quite replicate it. The carbon nanotubes and specific crystalline structures in the steel, suggest a level of understanding, or at least practical knowledge, that rivals modern materials science. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire, was so effective that enemy ships would burn even on water. The formula was a closely guarded secret, and when the empire fell, the secret was lost. We still don't know exactly what it was made of. The astronomical computers of ancient China, the water clocks of ancient Egypt, the batteries of ancient Mesopotamia, all of them suggest that technology is not a straight line, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, and that our ancestors were far more capable than we give them credit for. And then there are the technologies we can't explain at all, the acoustic properties of certain ancient sites, for example. At Newgrange in Ireland, a 5,000-year-old passage tomb, the interior chamber has acoustic properties that amplify certain frequencies, specifically the frequencies of the human voice in ritual chanting. The chamber acts as a resonator, creating effects that would have seemed magical or divine to the people using it. The same phenomenon appears at other sites. The Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza produces an echo that sounds like the chirp of the Quetzal bird, considered sacred by the Maya. The Whispering Gallery in the Temple of Heaven in Beijing allows a whisper at one side of the chamber to be heard clearly on the other side, hundreds of feet away. The Great Pyramid itself has acoustic properties that researchers are still studying. Certain chambers seem designed to resonate at specific frequencies. Were these effects intentional? Did ancient builders understand acoustics in ways we don't? And if so, why? What were they trying to achieve? Some researchers have proposed that ancient cultures use sound as a technology, for healing, for ritual, for altered states of consciousness. That the pyramids and temples weren't just buildings, but machines, designed to produce specific acoustic effects that would affect the people inside them. It sounds like pseudoscience, and maybe it is, but the acoustic properties are real, they're measurable, and it's hard to believe they're all accidental. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We're living through a knowledge bottleneck right now, and if civilization were to be reset tomorrow, most of what we know would be lost. Think about it. How much of our knowledge exists only in digital form? Billions of books, millions of scientific papers, entire libraries of information, all stored on servers and hard drives that would be useless without electricity. If the power grid went down permanently, from a solar storm, an EMP, societal collapse, all of that would become inaccessible within days or weeks. And even the knowledge that exists in physical form is fragile. Modern books are printed on acid paper that degrades within decades. The bindings fall apart. The ink fades. We've designed our information storage systems for convenience, not longevity. Meanwhile, ancient texts carved in stone have lasted thousands of years. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are still readable after 5,000 years. But how many modern books will be readable in 5,000 years? How many hard drives? How many USB sticks? We've also become hyper-specialized. In ancient times, a master craftsman might understand every step of creating a tool, from mining the ore to forging the blade. Today, no single person understands how to build a smartphone from scratch. The supply chains are global, the knowledge is distributed, and if those systems broke down, we wouldn't be able to replicate our own technology. A Stanford archaeologist named William Rathier once said that if modern civilization collapsed, future archaeologists would find almost nothing. Our buildings are made of materials that don't last: steel, glass, concrete that isn't as durable as Roman concrete. Our artifacts are made of plastic, which degrades. Our records are stored digitally, which requires technology to access. In 1,000 years, what would remain? landfills full of non-biodegradable waste, scattered ruins of concrete foundations, fragments of plastic and metal, and almost no record of who we were, what we knew, or what we achieved. We would become a mystery, a gap in the timeline, a silence just like the ones we've been talking about. And if someone in the future tried to piece together our civilization from the ruins, what would they conclude? Would they understand how advanced we were? Would they find the remains of our computers and recognize them as technology? Or would they dismiss them as religious artifacts, decorative objects, things whose purpose was lost? Would they tell stories about us? Would we become their Atlantis, their lost golden age, their myth of a civilization that flew through the air and spoke across continents, and knew the secrets of the universe? And would they believe those stories, or would they dismiss them as impossible, as exaggeration, as the fantasies of a primitive people who didn't understand how the world really worked? The cycle continues. Knowledge is gained and lost, gained and lost. And each time we think we're the first, the most advanced, the pinnacle. Until the reset comes and we learn, too late, that we were just another iteration, another attempt, another civilization that thought it was too advanced to fall. There's one more possibility we haven't fully explored, one more explanation for the patterns we see, the knowledge that appears and disappears, the cycles that seem to repeat. What if it's intentional? Not in the sense of a conspiracy, but in the sense of design. A natural design built into the fabric of time itself, or perhaps into the nature of consciousness, or the structure of civilizations. What if civilizations are meant to rise and fall? What if the resets aren't catastrophes to be avoided, but part of a larger pattern, a larger purpose that we can't see from our limited perspective? The ancient Stoics believed in the concept of ekperosis, the idea that the universe undergoes periodic cycles of destruction and rebirth through fire. It wasn't seen as a tragedy, but as a natural process, like the seasons. Winter must come before spring. Destruction must come before creation. The Buddhists speak of kalpa, vast cycles of time during which the universe comes into being, exists, and is destroyed, only to begin again. It's not punishment, it's just the way things are, the nature of existence itself. What if they're right? What if the resets serve a purpose we don't understand? A cleansing, a renewal, a way of preventing civilizations from becoming stagnant or overextended or disconnected from the natural world? Or what if it's even stranger? What if consciousness itself goes through cycles, and civilizations are the physical manifestation of those cycles? Rising when consciousness expands, falling when it contracts, only to rise again when the time is right. There are researchers who study collective consciousness, the idea that human minds are somehow connected, that we share information in ways we don't fully understand. The biologist Rupert Sheldrake calls it morphic resonance, the idea that patterns of behavior and knowledge can be transmitted across space and time through fields that connect similar forms. If he's right, then maybe knowledge doesn't really disappear when a civilization falls. Maybe it goes dormant, stored in some collective field of consciousness, waiting to be accessed again when conditions are right. That would explain why similar ideas appear independently in different cultures, not because they copied each other, but because they're all tapping into the same underlying field of information. It sounds mystical, and maybe it is. But it's also consistent with some findings in quantum physics, with phenomena like entanglement and non-locality, with the strange ways that information seems to behave at the deepest levels of reality. And if it's true, then the resets aren't endings at all. their transformations. The knowledge doesn't die. It's released, redistributed, made available for the next cycle. The memory keepers aren't just preserving information for the survivors, they're anchoring it in the collective consciousness, ensuring that it can't be completely lost. This is speculation, of course, but it's speculation that ancient cultures would have understood. They didn't see knowledge as something that existed in books or buildings. They saw it as something that existed in the cosmos itself, in the structure of reality, accessible to those who knew how to look. The real question isn't how many times civilization has been reset. The real question is, what are we supposed to learn from the cycle? What is the pattern trying to teach us? And are we finally ready to hear the answer? So here we are, at the edge of another possible reset, standing on the same precipice that countless others have stood on before us, looking out at an uncertain future, wondering if this time will be different. The signs are familiar if you know the pattern: climate instability, resource depletion, rising tensions between nations, technological advancement outpacing wisdom. The same markers that appeared before other collapses, other falls, other endings. But we also have something previous civilizations might not have had: awareness. We can see the pattern. We can study the past, learn from it, potentially break the cycle. The question is, will we? Or will we, like those before us, convince ourselves that this time is different, that we're too advanced to fall, that it can't happen to us, right up until the moment it does? The clock is ticking, the earth is shifting beneath our feet, and somewhere, in the ruins we haven't found yet, in the myths we haven't decoded, in the silence between the cycles, the answer is waiting. Waiting for us to finally listen, waiting for us to finally remember, waiting for us to finally understand what the stones, the stories, and the stars has been trying to tell us all along. We've been here before, and we'll be here again, unless we learn, unless we change, unless we break the cycle once and for all. The choice, as always, is ours, for now.